The arrow struck the tree an inch from Elena's head before she even heard the bowstring release. She dropped to the ground on instinct, her hand still tangled in the leather cord that led her old wolf, Fenwick. He growled low, his blind eyes rolling toward the sound, his gray fur bristling despite his age. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs as she pressed herself flat against the damp earth, waiting for a second arrow that never came. Silence returned to the forest. Only the wind moved through the high branches, and somewhere far off a woodpecker resumed its work as though nothing had happened at all. She stayed still for a long moment, counting her own breaths, before she dared to lift her head. The arrow was still lodged in the bark above her, its shaft trembling slightly from the impact. She reached up with a shaking hand and touched the fletching. It was not the crude, feathered kind the local hunters used. This one was smooth, dark, expensive. A noble's arrow, or a soldier's. Fenwick whined and pressed his body against her leg, and she wrapped her arm around his neck, grateful for his steady warmth, even as her own pulse refused to slow. "Someone's out here," she whispered, more to herself than to him, though she liked to think he understood her, the way old companions understand each other, through sound and touch rather than words. Elena had walked this path every morning for 3 years, ever since she found Fenwick as a half-starved, half-blind pup abandoned near the old quarry. Her father, before he passed, had taught her that some creatures survive not because they are strong, but because someone chooses to walk beside them. She had taken those words and given them to the wolf, and in turn, the wolf had given her a reason to rise before dawn each day, when the world still belonged to no one but the two of them, until today. She crouched low and scanned the trees, the mist clinging to the underbrush like a living thing. There was no one in sight, no rustle of retreating footsteps, no glint of metal through the leaves. Whoever had loosed that arrow was either gone, or was watching her right now, patient and hidden. "We should go home," she murmured, though something in her chest resisted the thought. She had never been a woman who ran from questions. She rose slowly, keeping Fenwick close, and began to retrace the path they had walked 1,000 times before, her eyes darting to every shadow, every bent branch, every place a man might crouch and wait. It took nearly 20 minutes to reach the village, 20 minutes in which her mind conjured a dozen explanations, each more unsettling than the last. Perhaps it was a careless hunter, aiming for a deer that never appeared. Perhaps it was a warning meant for someone else entirely, and she had simply wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. Or perhaps, and this thought chilled her more than the others, someone had aimed for her on purpose. The village of Ashford Hollow sat in a shallow valley, its thatched roofs huddled together like sheep against the cold. Smoke rose from a handful of chimneys, and the smell of baking bread drifted from the widow Marigold's cottage at the edge of the square. It was a small, unremarkable place, the kind of village that never appeared on any map worth mentioning, and Elena had always found comfort in that. Nothing important ever happened in Ashford Hollow, nothing dangerous, until now. She led Fenwick straight to their cottage, bolted the door behind them, and stood with her back against the wood, breathing hard. It was only then that she noticed her hands were still shaking. Fenwick settled onto his usual spot by the hearth, his blind eyes fixed on nothing, his ears twitching at every sound the old cottage made as it settled around them. Elena watched him for a long moment, taking comfort in the fact that he, at least, seemed unbothered, as though the world had not changed at all in the past half hour. But it had. She spent the rest of the morning trying to convince herself that the arrow meant nothing. Perhaps a young nobleman had ridden into the forest for sport, careless with his aim, embarrassed by the near miss, and had simply fled rather than face the consequence of nearly striking a village girl. It was the kind of story that made sense in daylight, when the sun filtered warm through the shutters and the bread was rising on the hearth. But when evening came, and the shadows stretched long across the floor, the explanation felt thinner. She found herself glancing at the door more than once, listening for footsteps that never came. By the time she went to bed, she had almost convinced herself to stay inside the following morning, to break the routine that had defined her mornings for 3 years. But when dawn arrived, gray and quiet, she found she could not do it. Fenwick needed his walk. He was old, and his joints stiffened badly if he did not move. And more than that, the ritual itself had become something she could not simply abandon out of fear. Her father used to say that fear was a poor reason to stop living, and though he had been gone 5 years now, His voice still lived somewhere behind her ribs, steady and certain. She took the same path, though this time she carried her father's old hunting knife tucked into her belt, its worn leather sheath pressing reassuringly against her hip. It was not much of a weapon against an archer, but it was something, and something felt better than nothing. The forest was quiet in the way that only early mornings are quiet, thick with mist and the smell of wet pine. Fenwick walked beside her at his usual pace, his nose lifted to catch the scents she could not smell, his old legs carrying him with the same careful confidence he always showed on this familiar ground. She kept her eyes moving, scanning the trees, listening for any sound that did not belong. They reached the small clearing, where the arrow had struck the day before. The shaft was gone now, though a fresh scar remained in the bark, pale and raw against the darker wood around it. Someone had come back for the arrow. That thought unsettled her more than the arrow itself had. She stood there a moment, staring at the mark, when Fenwick's ears pricked forward, and his whole body went still. "What is it?" she whispered, crouching beside him, following the direction of his attention, though she could see nothing through the mist. And then she heard it. The soft, unmistakable sound of a horse's hooves, moving slowly, deliberately, somewhere just beyond the tree line. Her hand went to the knife at her belt, though she did not draw it. She had learned long ago that showing fear only invited trouble, and so she straightened her spine and waited, her eyes fixed on the mist where the sound seemed to come from. A figure emerged from between the trees, tall and cloaked, mounted on a horse the color of midnight. The hood of his cloak was drawn low over his face, but she could see enough to know he was watching her, and had likely been watching her for some time. "You should not be walking these woods alone," the man said, his voice low and measured, carrying an accent she could not quite place, though it was smoother than anything she had heard in Ashford Hollow. "I am not alone," she said, gesturing to Fenwick, who had risen to his feet beside her, hackles raised despite his blindness, sensing the stranger's presence with whatever instincts still remained sharp within him. The man's gaze shifted to the wolf, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, just enough that Elena noticed it even through the shadow of his hood. "A blind wolf," he said, and there was no mockery in his voice, only quiet curiosity. "That is an unusual companion for a young woman walking alone before dawn." "He is not unusual to me," Elena said, lifting her chin slightly. "He is simply Fenwick." The stranger was silent for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, though not entirely with fear. There was something in his stillness, something careful and deliberate, that suggested a man unused to being questioned, and yet he did not press the matter further. "There was an arrow here yesterday," she said instead, deciding boldness was safer than silence. "Struck the tree not a foot from where I stood. Do you know anything of that?" For the first time, something flickered across the stranger's face, something that might have been surprise, or perhaps concern, though it was gone, before she could be certain. "I know only that these woods are not always as safe as they seem," he said carefully. "You would do well to stay closer to the village." "That is not an answer," Elena said. The stranger's mouth curved, just slightly, at the corner, an expression that was not quite a smile, but suggested one lived somewhere beneath his composure. "No," he agreed, "it is not." He said nothing further on the matter, and Elena, sensing she would gain nothing more from him, chose not to press. Instead, she watched as he dismounted, moving with an ease that suggested years of practice, and approached slowly, his hands open and visible, the universal gesture of a man who did not wish to appear threatening. Fenwick, surprisingly, did not growl as he drew near. Instead, the old wolf's nose lifted, testing the air, and after a long moment, his tail gave a single, cautious wag, a gesture Elena had not seen him offer to a stranger in years. "He likes you," she said, unable to hide her surprise. "Animals often know things before we do," the stranger said, crouching to a respectful distance and extending a hand, palm up, allowing Fenwick to approach on his own terms. The wolf sniffed the offered hand and then, to Elena's continued astonishment, pressed his head gently against the stranger's palm. "I am called Ash," the man said, straightening, though he did not offer a surname, and Elena did not ask for one. Names, in her experience, mattered less than actions, and this man's actions, strange as the morning had shown her nothing but a peculiar gentleness. "Elena," she said in return. Elena, he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. And your wolf? Fenwick, she said. I found him near the old quarry, when he was still a pup, half-starved and already losing his sight. The other villagers said I should have let him be, that a blind wolf would never survive on his own, and would only bring trouble to whoever tried to save him. And yet here he stands, Ash said, glancing down at the old wolf with something like admiration, years later, walking beside you every morning. Every morning, Elena confirmed, rain or shine, it is the one thing in my life that has never changed. Ash was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the mist-shrouded trees, and Elena had the strange sense that her words had struck something in him, some private thought he was not prepared to share with a village girl he had only just met. I should return before the sun is fully up, she said finally, feeling the strangeness of the moment settle over her, the way one feels after waking from a vivid dream that refuses to fully release its hold. My mother will worry. Of course, Ash said, stepping back to give her room, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than courtesy required. Perhaps I will see you again. Perhaps, Elena said, though she was not entirely certain she wanted to. There was something about this stranger, something both compelling and unsettling, that she could not quite name. She led Fenwick back toward the village, resisting the urge to look over her shoulder, though she felt his eyes on her the entire way, until the trees finally swallowed the clearing from view. That night, lying awake in the small room she had once shared with her younger sister before her sister married and moved to the neighboring town, Elena found her thoughts circling back to the stranger's face, or rather, the parts of it she had managed to glimpse beneath the hood. There had been something familiar in the line of his jaw, something she could not place, though she was certain she had never seen him before in her life. She told herself it did not matter. Strangers passed through the forest sometimes, hunters and travelers on their way to the larger towns beyond the valley. There was no reason to believe this man was anything more than what he claimed to be, a traveler who happened to cross her path at an unusual hour. And yet, when she finally drifted into sleep, it was not the arrow she dreamed of, but the quiet way Fenwick had pressed his head into the stranger's palm, as though recognizing something in him that Elena herself could not yet see. The following morning, she almost did not go. She stood at the door, with Fenwick's leash in hand, arguing with herself in the gray half-light, telling herself that one missed walk would not harm the old wolf, that perhaps it was wiser to wait a day or two, until the strangeness of the arrow and the stranger had faded from memory. But Fenwick nudged her hand insistently, whining softly, and she realized she could not deny him this simple joy out of her own uncertainty. She fastened the leash and stepped out into the cold morning air, telling herself firmly that she would take a different path today, one that avoided the clearing entirely. She managed to keep that promise for nearly half the walk. It was Fenwick who led them back toward the familiar clearing, tugging gently at the leash with a determination she had rarely seen from him, as though some part of him remembered the stranger's scent and wished to find it again. Elena sighed and allowed herself to be led, telling herself it was simply easier than fighting him, though some quiet part of her recognized the excuse for what it was. The clearing was empty when they arrived, and Elena felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment settle over her, an emotion she refused to examine too closely. She stood there a moment, watching the mist curl between the trees, before turning to continue their usual route. It was then that she noticed something resting at the base of the scarred tree, something that had not been there the day before. A small bundle of wildflowers, tied together with a simple length of twine, lay at the foot of the trunk where the arrow had struck. Elena crouched beside it, lifting the bundle carefully, studying the flowers with a growing sense of unease that was not entirely unpleasant. They were common flowers, the kind that grew wild throughout the forest, nothing extravagant or telling, and yet the gesture itself felt significant, in a way she could not quite articulate. There was no note, no explanation, nothing to indicate who had left them, or why. But she did not need one. She understood, somehow, without being told, exactly who had placed them there. She should have been unsettled by the thought of a stranger returning to this spot, watching for her, leaving gifts in the quiet hours before dawn. Instead, she found herself smiling, just slightly, as she tucked the flowers into the pocket of her cloak, and continued down the path with Fenwick trotting contentedly beside her, unaware of the small stone that had just settled itself into the still water of her heart, sending ripples she would not fully understand for many mornings yet to come. The days that followed, fell into a strange new rhythm. Elena told herself each morning that she would not think of the stranger, that the flowers had been a passing kindness, and nothing more. And each morning, she found herself walking a little slower through the clearing, a little more attentive to the sounds of the forest around her. He did not appear again for nearly a week, and in his absence, Elena found herself oddly restless, checking the base of the scarred tree each morning out of habit, though she told herself it meant nothing. When he finally returned, it was not with flowers this time, but with a quiet greeting and an offer to walk alongside her for a while, an offer she accepted with far less hesitation than she might have expected of herself only days before. They spoke of small things at first, the weather, the changing season, the particular stubbornness of Fenwick when he caught an interesting scent and refused to be moved. Ash listened with a quality of attention Elena had rarely encountered, as though her words carried a weight and importance she had never considered them to hold. It was not until their third such meeting that she asked him directly what business brought him so often to these woods, so far from any town or road she recognized. "I find peace here," he said simply, and something in his voice suggested the answer was truer than its simplicity implied. "There are places in my life that offer little of it, and this forest, strange as it may sound, has become something of a refuge." "From what?" Elena asked, genuinely curious now. Ash was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the trees, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed far older than his years should have allowed. "From expectations," he said. "From the weight of being watched, always, by people who want something from you, even when they claim to want nothing at all." Elena did not fully understand what he meant, not then, but she recognized the honesty in his words, the rare vulnerability of a man unaccustomed to sharing such thoughts with anyone. She did not press him further, sensing instinctively that some truths needed to be given freely, in their own time, rather than pulled forth by curious questions. Instead, she simply said, "This forest has always felt like that to me too. A place where nothing is expected of you except to walk, and breathe, and be present." Ash looked at her then, with an expression she could not quite read, something between gratitude and something deeper, something she was not yet prepared to name. "Yes," he said quietly. "Exactly that." They walked in comfortable silence after that, Fenwick trotting contentedly between them, and Elena found herself thinking, with a small flutter of something she refused to call anticipation, that she hoped this stranger named Ash would return again tomorrow. She had no way of knowing, as the mist began to lift and the first true light of morning broke through the canopy above them, that the man walking beside her carried a weight far greater than expectations, a truth that would eventually reshape everything she believed about the quiet mornings she had come to treasure, and about her own place in a world far larger and more complicated than the small valley she called home. For now, though, there was only the forest, the old blind wolf who had somehow led her to this moment, and a stranger whose careful words hinted at a life she could not yet imagine, walking beside her, as the sun finally broke free of the horizon and spilled gold across the waking trees. The arrow, the mystery of who had loosed it, remained unanswered, tucked away in the back of her mind, like a splinter she had not yet found time to remove. But in that moment, with the birds beginning their morning chorus and Fenwick's tail wagging against her leg, Elena found she did not have the heart to worry over it. Not yet, not when something new and uncertain and quietly wonderful had begun to take root in the space where her fear had been. She did not yet know his true name. She did not yet know the weight of the kingdom that pressed upon his shoulders each time he returned to the world beyond these trees. She knew only the sound of his voice, low and thoughtful, and the way her old wolf had trusted him from the very first moment, as though some instinct deeper than sight had recognized in him something worthy of trust. It would be many mornings yet before she learned the truth of who Ash truly was, and by then, the roots that had begun to grow in this quiet clearing would already run too deep to easily pull free. Lord Bramwell noticed the change in the king before anyone else at court dared to mention it aloud. It began as small things, easy to overlook. King Edmund, who had once risen with the sun only because duty demanded it, now rose earlier still, slipping from the palace grounds before even the kitchen staff had lit their morning fires. He returned each time with mud on his boots and a strange, unguarded softness in his eyes that Bramwell had not seen since the death of the king's old hound, Grendel, nearly a year before. At first, Bramwell assumed it was simply grief, finding new expression. A man walking alone through the countryside, to clear his mind of burdens too heavy to carry within stone walls. He said nothing, respecting the king's need for solitude, though he watched with the careful attention of a man who had served 3 generations of the royal family, and had learned, through long experience, that a king's private habits rarely stayed private for long. It was the stable master who first mentioned the horse. "His Majesty rides the same route each morning," the old man said one evening, as Bramwell inspected the royal stables for a matter entirely unrelated. "Same direction, same hour. Near enough that you could set a bell by it. Toward the eastern forest, past Ashford Hollow." Bramwell filed the information away without comment, though something in it nagged at him for days afterward. Ashford Hollow was little more than a scattering of cottages, a village so small and unremarkable that Bramwell doubted he could have named its lord even if pressed. There was nothing there that should draw a king's repeated attention, and yet Edmund returned to it morning after morning with a consistency that suggested purpose rather than mere wandering. Bramwell might have let the matter rest entirely had it not been for the arrow. He learned of it from one of the king's personal guard, a young man named Alistair who had been assigned, against his own protests, to shadow the king at a discreet distance during his morning rides, a precaution insisted upon by the royal council after a series of threats had been made against the crown in recent months. Alistair reported, with visible unease, that an arrow had been loosed near the king's position during one such ride, striking a tree close enough to have caused genuine harm had its aim been only slightly different. "Was His Majesty struck?" Bramwell demanded, his heart lurching with an alarm he rarely allowed himself to show. "No, my lord," Alistair said quickly. "The arrow came nowhere near him directly. It struck near a young woman standing some distance away, in a clearing the king had approached only moments before." "A young woman," Bramwell repeated slowly, turning the words over as though testing their weight. "And the king's response to this incident?" Alistair hesitated, clearly uncertain how much he was permitted to share. "He seemed troubled by it, my lord. He asked me to search the surrounding trees for any sign of the archer, though we found nothing. He instructed me to say nothing of the matter to the council." Bramwell's jaw tightened. A king, already the target of unknown threats, riding alone into unfamiliar woods each morning, now standing near enough to a stray arrow that a village girl had nearly been struck in his place. The implications settled over him with the weight of genuine dread. "You will continue to follow him," Bramwell said, "at a greater distance than before, but you will not lose sight of him again, and you will report anything unusual to me directly, before it reaches the council." Alistair nodded, though Bramwell could see the young guard's discomfort at being asked to spy upon the king he was sworn to protect. It was a delicate position, one Bramwell understood well, having occupied similar positions of divided loyalty many times throughout his years of service. For the next several days, Bramwell said nothing to the king directly, choosing instead to observe from a careful distance, gathering what information he could, without alerting Edmund to his growing concern. He learned, through Alistair's quiet reports, that the king had begun speaking regularly with a young woman from the village, a woman who kept an old blind wolf as a companion, and walked the forest path each morning at the same hour the king chose to ride. The pieces, once assembled, painted a picture that troubled Bramwell deeply, though not entirely for the reasons he might have expected. It was not simply the matter of propriety, though that concerned him enough. A king, even one riding in disguise, could not simply befriend a common village woman without consequence, should the truth ever become known. Rival houses, already restless with ambitions of their own, would seize upon any perceived weakness or scandal, using it to undermine the king's authority, at a time when the kingdom could ill afford such instability. But there was also the matter of the arrow, and the unsettling possibility that someone had already discovered the king's private routine, and had chosen to act upon that knowledge with violent intent. If an assassin had learned of the king's morning rides, learned enough to lie in wait along his chosen path, then every visit to that forest placed Edmund in danger far greater than he seemed willing to acknowledge. Bramwell resolved to speak with the king directly, though he chose his moment carefully, waiting until an evening when Edmund seemed less burdened by the weight of his crown, more inclined toward honest conversation than defensive silence. He found the king alone in the small library adjoining his private chambers. a room Edmund had always favored for its quiet and its distance from the more formal spaces of the palace. The king sat near the window, a book open in his lap, though his eyes were fixed on something beyond the glass, some private thought that held his attention far more firmly than the pages before him. "Your Majesty," Bramwell said, announcing himself with the respectful formality their long acquaintance had never fully abandoned, despite the genuine friendship that had grown between them over many years of service. Edmund looked up, and something in his expression, a faint wariness that had not been there in earlier years, told Bramwell that the king already suspected the purpose of this visit. "Bramwell," Edmund said, setting the book aside, "you have the look of a man carrying news he does not wish to deliver." "I have concerns, Your Majesty, regarding your recent morning rides." Edmund's expression remained carefully neutral, though Bramwell had known him long enough to recognize the subtle tension that entered his shoulders. "My rides are my own business, Bramwell." "They were, Your Majesty, until an arrow was loosed near your position, striking close enough to a village woman that she might easily have been killed." Edmund's composure faltered, just slightly, and Bramwell saw genuine alarm flicker across the king's face, quickly masked, but not quickly enough. "How do you know of this?" "Alistair reported it to me, as I instructed him to do, given the growing threats against your safety in recent months. Your Majesty, I understand your need for solitude, for moments away from the demands of this court, but you cannot continue riding into unfamiliar woods, alone, at hours when your guard is reduced to a single man following at a distance. If someone has already discovered your routine, discovered enough to place an archer along your path, then every morning you ride to that forest, you place yourself in greater danger than you seem willing to admit." Edmund was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting back toward the window, toward the darkness beyond the glass, where the forest lay unseen but ever present in his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that struck Bramwell more deeply than any argument could have. "Do you know how long it has been, Bramwell, since I have spoken with anyone who did not want something from me? Since Grendel died, I have sat in council after council, surrounded by men who smile and bow, and speak of loyalty, while each of them calculates, behind those smiles, how my decisions might serve their own ambitions. I am tired, Bramwell. Tired in a way that no amount of rest within these walls seems able to cure." "And this village woman offers something different?" Bramwell asked, though his tone had softened considerably. "She does not know who I am," Edmund said quietly. "She speaks to me as though I am simply a man, nothing more, nothing less. She asks nothing of me, except honest conversation, and in return, she offers the same. I had forgotten what that felt like, Bramwell, until I found it again in that forest." Bramwell studied his king for a long moment, torn between the genuine sympathy he felt for a man clearly starved of simple human connection, and the equally genuine fear that this newfound comfort might come at a cost far greater than either of them yet understood. "I do not ask you to abandon this connection entirely, Your Majesty," Bramwell said finally, "but I must insist upon greater precaution, a larger guard, discreetly positioned, a thorough investigation into who might have loosed that arrow, and why. And, Your Majesty, forgive my bluntness, but you must consider what will happen, should this woman ever learn the truth of who you are. Such revelations rarely end without complication, particularly when they involve matters of the heart." Edmund's eyes flickered toward Bramwell at those last words, and though he said nothing to confirm or deny the implication, the silence itself told Bramwell everything he needed to know. "I will consider your counsel regarding the guard," Edmund said finally. "But I will not stop riding to that forest, Bramwell. Not yet. There are some things I am not yet prepared to surrender, even for the sake of caution." Bramwell bowed his head, recognizing the futility of further argument, at least for the moment. "Then I will see to it that your safety is better protected, Your Majesty, even if I cannot protect you from whatever this connection may eventually cost you." Edmund's expression softened, just slightly, at the genuine concern beneath Bramwell's formal words. "Thank you, old friend. I know this places you in a difficult position. It is a position I have occupied before, Your Majesty, and will likely occupy again," Bramwell said, allowing himself a small, wry smile. "Serving a king who insists on making his own choices has never been the easiest of tasks, but it has rarely been dull." That night, as Bramwell retired to his own chambers, his mind remained troubled by the conversation, and by the deeper mystery that still remained unresolved. Someone had loosed an arrow near the king's position, close enough to strike an innocent woman, and no explanation had yet emerged to account for it. Was it simply a stray shot from a careless hunter, as the king seemed inclined to believe? Or was it something more deliberate, a warning, or worse, a first attempt at something far more dangerous? Bramwell resolved to investigate the matter personally, quietly, without alerting the wider council to concerns that might prove nothing more than an unfortunate accident. He began by questioning the local hunters known to frequent the eastern forest, learning quickly that none among them recognized the description of the arrow Alistair had recovered from the scene, an arrow crafted with a precision and quality far beyond what any village hunter could typically afford. The implications of that discovery settled over Bramwell with growing unease. If the arrow had not come from a local hunter, then it had likely come from someone with resources, someone capable of affording finely crafted weapons, and skilled enough to use them with dangerous precision. The list of who might fit such a description, and who might have reason to wish harm upon the king, was troublingly long, filled with rival houses and ambitious nobles who had never fully accepted Edmund's claim to the throne following his father's death. He said nothing further to the king in the days that followed, choosing instead to continue his quiet investigation, while ensuring that Alistair's discreet watch over the royal rides continued without interruption. Each morning, he waited with growing anxiety for news of another incident, relieved each time Alistair returned, with nothing more alarming to report than the king's continued visits to the forest clearing, where the village woman walked her wolf. Bramwell had not yet met this Elena, had seen her only through the second-hand accounts Alistair provided, but he found himself increasingly curious about the woman who had managed to draw such genuine warmth from a king who had grown so guarded in recent years. Whatever she offered him, whatever simple comfort their morning conversations provided, it had clearly begun to matter to Edmund in ways that went far beyond mere curiosity or passing distraction. That mattering, Bramwell knew, was precisely what made the situation so dangerous. A king's heart, once given, however quietly or reluctantly, became a vulnerability that enemies would not hesitate to exploit, should they ever discover its existence. And given the arrow that had already been loosed, given the unanswered questions that still surrounded its origin, Bramwell could not shake the growing certainty that someone, somewhere, had already begun to notice the king's growing attachment to the quiet forest and the woman who walked it each morning. Whether that someone intended harm to the king directly, or to the woman who had unknowingly become entangled in matters far beyond her understanding, Bramwell could not yet say. But he resolved, as he extinguished the candle beside his bed and settled into an uneasy sleep, that he would not rest until he uncovered the truth, before that truth arrived in a form neither the king nor the village woman would be prepared to survive. Duke Cassian Thorne had never forgiven the council for choosing Edmund over his own father, a grievance he had carried quietly for nearly a decade, tending it in private the way other men tended gardens, with patience and careful attention to every detail that might one day bear fruit. His father had possessed a claim to the throne nearly as strong as Edmund's own father, a claim rooted in a marriage 3 generations past that some scholars argued should have carried equal weight in matters of succession. The council had decided otherwise, favoring the more direct line, and Cassian's father had accepted the decision with a public grace that masked a private bitterness he passed down to his son, along with his title and lands. Cassian had spent the years since Edmund's coronation building a network of allies among the nobility, men and women who harbored their own quiet resentments, their own belief that they deserved greater influence than the current king seemed willing to grant them. He moved carefully, never overtly challenging the crown, always maintaining the appearance of loyal service while quietly cultivating the seeds of doubt that might one day grow into something the council could not ignore. The arrow had not been his doing directly. Cassian was too careful a man to risk his own hand in something so obviously treasonous, should it ever be traced back to him. But he had heard whispers, through the careful network of informants he maintained throughout the palace and surrounding countryside, that the king had begun riding alone into the eastern forest, unguarded save for a single distant escort, meeting regularly with an unknown woman from a village so small it barely warranted mention. Such information, Cassian recognized immediately, held tremendous value, whether wielded as a tool of blackmail, a weapon of scandal, or simply as evidence of a king too distracted by private affairs to properly attend to the burdens of his crown. He had not ordered the arrow loosed, had in fact been troubled to learn of it through his own sources, uncertain whether it represented some rival scheme he had not yet uncovered, or simply the reckless action of an overzealous ally who had misunderstood the subtlety required for their shared cause. Whatever its origin, the arrow had served, inadvertently, to draw Cassian's attention more sharply toward the king's growing vulnerability. A man distracted by matters of the heart, a man willing to risk his own safety for private moments in an unguarded forest, was a man who might eventually be maneuvered into far greater mistakes, mistakes that could be exploited by those patient enough to wait for the right moment. Cassian resolved to learn more about this village woman, this Elena, before deciding how best to use the knowledge of her existence to his advantage. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, Edmund remained largely unaware of the careful machinations building around him, his mind occupied instead by memories of a hound named Grendel, and the strange, unexpected comfort he had begun to find in a forest clearing, far from the throne that defined every other hour of his waking life. He had been given Grendel as a young prince, barely more than a boy, a gift from his father meant to teach him responsibility and companionship in equal measure. The hound had grown alongside him through the difficult years of his adolescence, through his father's death, and his own hurried coronation, at an age when most men were still finding their footing in the world, let alone preparing to rule a kingdom. Grendel had asked nothing of him beyond simple companionship, had offered nothing but unwavering loyalty regardless of the burdens Edmund carried, or the decisions he was forced to make, decisions that often left him doubting his own judgment long into sleepless nights. When the old hound finally passed, nearly a year before Edmund first encountered Elena in the forest, something essential had gone quiet within him, a steadiness he had not realized he depended upon until it was suddenly, irrevocably absent. He had told no one, not even Bramwell, how deeply that loss had affected him, how the empty space beside his chair, each evening, had come to feel like a wound that refused to properly heal. The council had offered condolences, brief and formal, before moving swiftly on to matters of greater apparent importance, trade agreements, and border disputes, and the endless negotiations that consumed his days without ever touching the quieter grief he carried beneath his crown. It was Elena's blind old wolf that had first drawn his attention, that morning weeks ago, when he had ridden out simply to escape the suffocating formality of another council session, his mind heavy with decisions he did not feel equipped to make. He had seen her from a distance, guiding the aging creature with such patient tenderness, speaking to him in a low, steady voice despite the animal's inability to see her expressions, and something in that simple scene had struck Edmund with unexpected force. Here was a woman who cared for a creature that offered her nothing in return beyond its presence, who rose before dawn each day simply to ensure that a blind, aging wolf might feel the sun and smell the pines one more time. There was no calculation in it, no hidden ambition, only the pure, uncomplicated devotion that Edmund had not encountered in longer than he cared to admit. He had told himself, that first morning, that he was simply curious, that he would observe from a distance, and then return to his duties without further involvement. But curiosity had led to conversation, and conversation had led to something he was increasingly reluctant to name, something that pulled him back to that forest clearing, morning after morning, despite every rational argument his mind could construct against the practice. Bramwell's warnings echoed in his thoughts more frequently now, particularly following their conversation about the arrow, and Edmund knew, on some level, that his advisor's concerns were entirely justified. A king could not simply disappear each morning into unfamiliar woods, could not risk his safety for the sake of private comfort, not when threats against the crown remained an ever-present reality of his position. And yet, each time he considered abandoning the practice, each time he told himself that this must be the last visit, some part of him rebelled against the decision. He thought of Elena's easy laughter when Fenwick stubbornly refused to be moved from an interesting scent, of the quiet wisdom she offered, without any awareness of how deeply her words resonated with a king, burdened by responsibilities she could not begin to imagine. He thought of the way she spoke of her late father, of lessons about survival and choice that seemed to hold as much relevance for a king as they had for a young girl grieving her first great loss. She did not know he ruled a kingdom. She knew only a man named Ash, a stranger who rode alone through the forest and seemed to genuinely value her company, and Edmund found, with each passing morning, that he valued this anonymity more than he had ever expected to value anything connected to his crown. But anonymity, he understood with growing unease, could not last forever. Eventually, the truth would emerge, whether through his own confession or through circumstances beyond his control. And when that moment arrived, he had no certainty how Elena would respond to the revelation that the man she had come to trust was not simply a traveler seeking peace, but the king, whose decisions shaped the very kingdom in which her small village existed. He resolved, as he had resolved many times before, to tell her the truth soon, before circumstances forced the revelation upon them both without warning. But each morning, faced with her warm greeting and Fenwick's enthusiastic welcome, he found himself postponing the confession once again, unwilling to risk shattering the fragile peace they had built together in that quiet forest clearing. It was during one such morning, nearly 2 weeks after his conversation with Bramwell, that Edmund finally began to understand the true depth of what he risked losing, should the truth ever emerge in the wrong way. He arrived at the clearing to find Elena already waiting, though not with her usual warm greeting. Instead, she stood with her arms crossed, her expression troubled in a way he had not seen before. "What is it?" he asked, dismounting quickly, genuine concern overriding his usual careful composure. "Someone has been asking questions in the village," she said, her voice low despite the empty forest around them. "About you." Edmund's stomach tightened. "What kind of questions?" "A traveler came through yesterday, asking whether anyone had seen a man matching your description, riding through these woods each morning. He offered coin for information, though most of the villagers had nothing useful to tell him, since you have never given us a full name, and none of us know where you come from." "Did anyone speak with him at length?" Edmund asked, his mind already racing through the implications, the growing certainty that Bramwell's warnings had not been unfounded. Old Marigold spoke with him briefly, though she told him little beyond confirming that a stranger sometimes rides through the forest in the early mornings. "She did not mention me specifically, though I fear it would not take much effort for anyone determined enough to make the connection, given how often you have been seen near this clearing." Edmund ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of genuine distress that Elena had rarely seen from him in their previous meetings. "This is precisely what I feared," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Ash," Elena said carefully, using the only name she knew for him, "who are you truly?" "I have asked myself this question many times since we first met, and each time, the answer seems to matter less than the simple fact of your company. But if strangers are now asking questions in my village, if someone believes there is enough reason to seek information about you, then perhaps it is time you told me the truth." Edmund looked at her for a long moment, torn between the desire to finally unburden himself of the secret he had carried through every one of their meetings, and the fear of what that truth might cost him, standing here in this quiet clearing that had become, against all reasonable expectation, the closest thing to genuine peace he had known in years. "I will tell you," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "But not today, and not like this, with fear already hanging over both of us. Give me time to ensure your safety first, to understand who is asking these questions and why. Once I know you are protected, I will tell you everything." Elena studied him carefully, and though frustration flickered briefly across her features, she nodded slowly, recognizing something in his tone that suggested this was not a request he made lightly. "Very well," she said, "but do not make me wait too long, Ash. I have grown fond of honest conversation between us, and secrets, however well-intentioned, have a way of poisoning even the most genuine connections, if left too long unaddressed." "I know," Edmund said quietly. "Believe me, I know that better than you might imagine." They walked together through the rest of the morning, in a silence heavier than any that had passed between them before, both aware that something had shifted, that the careful bubble of anonymity they had built together had begun, inevitably, to crack under the weight of a world neither of them could fully control. Fenwick, sensing the tension between them, pressed close against Elena's legs throughout the walk, offering the same steady comfort he had provided her for years, though even his presence could not fully dispel the growing unease that had settled over the morning like an early frost. When Edmund finally departed, promising to return the following day, he rode back toward the palace with his mind consumed by a single, urgent question. Who had sent that traveler to ask questions in Ashford Hollow? And how much time remained before whatever threat lay behind those questions moved beyond mere inquiry into something far more dangerous? He found Bramwell waiting in his private study upon his return. an expression of barely controlled alarm on the older man's usually composed face. "Your Majesty," Bramwell said immediately, "we have a problem." "I am aware," Edmund said grimly, settling into the chair across from his advisor. "A traveler was asking questions in Ashford Hollow yesterday, seeking information about a man matching my description." Bramwell's expression darkened further. "It is worse than that, Your Majesty. I have identified the traveler, through my own inquiries. He is known to associate with Duke Cassian Thorne." The name settled over Edmund with the weight of genuine dread. Cassian Thorne had never openly challenged his rule, had always maintained the careful appearance of loyal service, but Edmund had long suspected the Duke's ambitions ran deeper than his public conduct suggested. "You believe Thorne is responsible for the arrow as well?" Edmund asked. "I cannot yet confirm it directly," Bramwell admitted, "but the timing, and now this inquiry into your identity, suggests a pattern too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. If Thorne has discovered your connection to this village woman, Your Majesty, he will not hesitate to use that knowledge against you, whether through public scandal or something far more dangerous." Edmund closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the situation settling fully upon him for the first time. He had allowed himself, over these past weeks, to believe that the forest clearing existed, somehow separate from the political machinations that consumed the rest of his life, a private sanctuary, untouched by ambition or threat. That belief, he now understood with painful clarity, had been nothing more than a comforting illusion. "What do you recommend?" he asked quietly. "Increased protection for the village woman, immediately, though discreetly enough not to draw further attention to her significance. A thorough investigation into Thorne's recent activities, to determine the full extent of what he may already know or suspect. And Your Majesty, forgive me, but I must again urge you to consider whether continuing these morning visits serves any purpose beyond increasing the danger to both yourself and this young woman." Edmund was silent for a long moment, staring at nothing, his mind turning over possibilities he had never fully allowed himself to consider before now. The comfortable fiction he had maintained, that his identity might remain hidden indefinitely, that Elena might never need to know the truth of who he was, had collapsed entirely with the news of Thorne's inquiries. "I will not abandon her, Bramwell," he said finally, his voice carrying a resolve that surprised even himself. "Whatever danger this connection now poses, I will not simply walk away and leave her exposed to whatever threat Thorne may pose, not after everything she has offered me without ever knowing my true name." "Then you must tell her the truth, Your Majesty, and soon," Bramwell said. "Before Thorne, or whoever else may be seeking this information, tells her first, in a manner far less kind than any explanation you might offer yourself." Edmund nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in his advisor's words even as dread settled deeper into his chest. He had promised Elena an explanation, had promised to ensure her safety first, but Bramwell's warning made clear that safety and honesty could no longer remain separate concerns. The truth would need to come soon, whether he felt fully prepared to offer it or not, and with that truth would come a reckoning neither he nor Elena could yet fully anticipate. Alistair had never been assigned a task quite like this one before, and as he settled into the shadow of a large oak overlooking the eastern edge of Ashford Hollow, he found himself wondering whether guarding a village woman without her knowledge counted more as protection or as a strange, uncomfortable form of trespass. Bramwell's instructions had been clear enough. Watch the woman named Elena, remain unseen, report anything unusual immediately, and intervene without hesitation should any genuine threat present itself. The king had approved the arrangement reluctantly, torn between his desire to protect her and his fear that an obvious guard might frighten her or draw unwanted attention to her significance. Alistair took his post seriously, arriving well before dawn each morning to ensure he was settled and hidden long before Elena emerged from her cottage, with the old wolf at her side. He watched her walk the familiar path toward the forest clearing, noted every person she passed, every sound that seemed out of place, every shadow that lingered a moment too long among the trees. For 3 days, nothing unusual occurred. Elena walked her usual route, met with the king in the clearing, and returned home without incident, entirely unaware that a second set of eyes now watched over her mornings alongside the king's own careful attention. It was on the 4th day that Alistair noticed the horse tracks. They were fresh, cutting across the northern edge of the path Elena typically favored, tracks belonging to a horse shod, with a distinctive pattern he did not recognize from any of the palace stables. He crouched low, examining the impressions carefully, his training urging him toward caution, even as curiosity pulled him deeper into the surrounding brush to investigate further. The tracks led toward a small rise overlooking the clearing, where Elena and the king typically met, a position that offered clear sightlines across the entire area, precisely the kind of vantage point a skilled archer might choose to observe, or to strike, without being easily seen in return. Alistair's blood ran cold as the implications settled over him. He followed the tracks carefully, noting how they doubled back upon themselves in places, suggesting whoever rode this horse had waited here for some time, watching, before eventually departing. He found, near the base of a large pine, a small collection of discarded feathers, the kind used in fletching arrows, along with a scrap of dark cloth caught on a low branch, as though someone had brushed past in haste. He gathered what evidence he could, and made his way back toward the palace, with far greater urgency than his morning ride had begun with, his mind already composing the report he would need to deliver to Bramwell without delay. Meanwhile, in the clearing below, Elena and Edmund remained entirely unaware of how closely danger had positioned itself above their quiet meeting, focused instead on a conversation that had grown increasingly difficult since Elena's revelation about the traveler asking questions in her village. "You said you would tell me the truth once you knew I was safe," Elena said, her tone gentle but insistent, as they walked the familiar path with Fenwick trotting between them. "Has that time come yet?" Edmund hesitated, torn between Bramwell's counsel to reveal the truth soon and his own uncertainty about how best to deliver news that would fundamentally alter the nature of their relationship, perhaps beyond any hope of preserving what they had built together. "Soon," he said finally, hating the inadequacy of the answer, even as he offered it. "I promise you, Elena, it will be soon. But there are matters I must first resolve, matters that affect not only my own safety, but yours as well." "You keep saying this," Elena replied, a note of genuine frustration entering her voice for the first time since their meetings had begun. "Every day soon becomes tomorrow, and tomorrow becomes another day after that. I have trusted you with more honesty than I have offered anyone since my father passed, and yet you continue to hold something back from me, something significant enough that its revelation apparently requires careful timing and elaborate precaution. I understand your frustration," Edmund said quietly, "and I do not blame you for it. But please believe me when I say that the truth I carry is not one I withhold from any desire to deceive you. I withhold it because once spoken, it cannot be unspoken, and I fear what it may cost us both, particularly given the danger that already seems to be gathering around us." Elena studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly despite her lingering frustration. "Whatever this truth is, Ash, I would rather face it directly than continue living beneath its shadow, wondering each day whether today will finally be the day you choose to trust me fully." "You have given me no reason to doubt your trustworthiness," Edmund said. "The doubt, if it exists at all, lies entirely within my own uncertainty about how the world beyond this forest might respond to what we have built here." Before Elena could respond further, Fenwick's ears suddenly pricked forward, his body going rigid in the way Elena had learned, over years of companionship, to recognize as genuine alarm rather than mere curiosity. "Something's wrong," she said quietly, her hand instinctively moving toward the knife at her belt. Edmund's own instincts, honed through years of court intrigue, and the constant awareness of potential threats that came with his position, immediately shifted into heightened alertness. He scanned the tree line surrounding the clearing, his hand moving toward the sword he carried beneath his cloak, a weapon he had begun bringing on these rides, only after the first arrow had reminded him how quickly peaceful mornings could turn dangerous. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, positioning himself slightly in front of Elena, a protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity, even as he acted upon it. They stood in tense silence for several long moments, listening for any sound that might confirm whatever danger Fenwick's instincts had detected. The forest around them remained still, unnervingly so, as though even the birds had chosen to hold their breath alongside the two humans and the aging wolf standing alert in the clearing's center. It was Alistair, arriving at a full run from the direction of the ridge, who finally broke the silence, calling out a warning as he approached, careful to keep his voice pitched low enough to avoid carrying too far beyond their immediate position. "My lord," he said, using the coded title they had agreed upon to avoid revealing the king's identity in Elena's presence. There is evidence someone has been watching this clearing from the northern ridge. I found fresh tracks and signs of an extended presence, along with materials suggesting archery equipment. Elena's eyes widened as she looked between Alistair and Edmund, the pieces of a puzzle she had not fully understood, suddenly beginning to align into a more troubling picture. "You have a guard," she said slowly, "watching over these meetings. Why would a simple traveler require such protection?" Edmund closed his eyes briefly, recognizing that the careful timing he had hoped to control had just been stripped from his hands entirely, by circumstances beyond his ability to manage. "Elena," he said quietly, "I think it is time I told you the truth, whatever consequences may follow." But before he could continue, Alistair's expression shifted to renewed alarm, his gaze fixed on something beyond Edmund's shoulder, back toward the ridge he had just descended from. "My lord," he said urgently, "we should move. Now. Whoever left those tracks may still be nearby, and this clearing offers too clear a line of sight to risk remaining here any longer." Edmund nodded sharply, his protective instincts overriding his desire to finally offer Elena the honesty she deserved. "We will speak of this, I promise you. But Alistair is right. We must find safer ground first." He reached for Elena's hand, an instinctive gesture born of genuine concern rather than any calculated intention, and led her quickly toward the denser cover of the surrounding trees, Fenwick following close behind, with the alert wariness of an animal who, despite his blindness, had clearly sensed the genuine danger that had settled over what should have been another peaceful morning. They moved swiftly through the forest, Alistair leading the way with the practiced efficiency of a trained guard, choosing a path that avoided open ground and offered maximum cover from any potential observer positioned on higher terrain. Elena kept pace despite her confusion and mounting fear, trusting the urgency in both men's demeanor, even as questions multiplied rapidly within her mind. They did not stop until they had reached a small hollow well hidden by dense undergrowth, a natural depression in the terrain that offered protection from any direct line of sight, while still allowing them to monitor the surrounding area for signs of pursuit. "I believe we are safe here, for the moment," Alistair said, though his tone carried a wariness that suggested the word safe remained relative, given the circumstances. Edmund turned to Elena, his expression grave, the weight of what he was about to reveal evident in every line of his posture. "Elena, I owe you the truth, and I have delayed it far longer than I should have. My name is not simply Ash. I am King Edmund, ruler of this kingdom, and the danger that has followed us this morning likely stems from enemies who have discovered my presence in this forest and seek to use that knowledge, or perhaps you yourself, against me." For a long moment, Elena said nothing, her expression cycling rapidly through shock, disbelief, and something that looked uncomfortably close to betrayal, emotions Edmund had feared, precisely because he understood how justified they truly were. "You are the king," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time, every conversation, every morning, we have shared in that clearing, and you allowed me to believe I was simply speaking with a traveler." "I know how this must feel," Edmund said quietly, "and I do not ask for your forgiveness, not yet. But please understand, Elena, that everything I shared with you in that clearing, every honest word, every genuine moment of comfort I found in your company, none of that was false, regardless of the name I withheld." Elena took a step back, her arms wrapping around herself as though seeking protection from the weight of this sudden revelation, Fenwick pressing close against her legs in response to her evident distress. "I need time," she said finally, her voice thick with emotions she was clearly struggling to process. "Time to understand what this means, for both of us, and for whatever danger now seems to be following you into my village, into my life." "You have every right to that time," Edmund said, though the words cost him more than he had expected, watching the careful trust they had built together over these past weeks suddenly fracture beneath the weight of truth he had withheld for too long. "But please, allow Alistair to ensure your safety, whatever you decide about our future conversations. Whatever danger has found its way to this forest, it exists regardless of how you choose to respond to what I have just told you." Elena nodded slowly, though her eyes remained guarded in a way that struck Edmund with a sharper pain than he had anticipated, a pain that made clear just how much he had come to value her trust, and how thoroughly he now feared he might have lost it entirely through his own prolonged silence. The days that followed the revelation passed in a strange, uneasy limbo for Elena, caught between the anger she felt at having been deceived and the undeniable truth that every genuine moment of comfort she had found in Ash, in Edmund, in whatever name truly belonged to him, had felt entirely real at the time it was offered. She did not walk to the forest clearing the following morning, choosing instead to remain within the village, tending to small tasks around her cottage, while Fenwick paced restlessly near the door, sensing her distress and confused by the sudden break in their familiar routine. She told herself the choice was about clarity, about needing space to process a truth too large to accept easily, but she recognized, even as she made the decision, that some part of her simply feared what she might feel upon seeing him again. Alistair remained nearby throughout that day, though he kept a respectful distance, positioned discreetly enough that Elena might have missed his presence entirely, had she not already learned, through recent events, to watch more carefully for signs of hidden observers among the trees surrounding her village. It was late in the afternoon when a messenger arrived at her cottage door, a young palace servant who delivered a simple, folded note bearing no royal seal, nothing that might draw attention should it fall into the wrong hands. Elena opened it with trembling fingers, recognizing immediately the careful, measured handwriting she had come to associate with the man she had known only as Ash. The note contained no elaborate explanation, no attempt to justify the deception she still struggled to fully process. Instead, it offered only a simple request, that she allow him to explain fully, in person, whenever she felt ready, and that regardless of her decision, she should trust Alistair's continued protection, until whatever threat currently gathered around them had been properly identified and addressed. Elena read the note 3 times, before folding it carefully, and tucking it into the same pocket where she had once kept the wildflowers he had left for her weeks before, a gesture that surprised her with its own quiet significance, suggesting that whatever anger she still carried had not entirely displaced the deeper trust that had grown between them. She did not respond immediately, allowing herself instead the space to sit with her conflicting emotions through the remainder of that day and into the evening, watching Fenwick settle by the hearth with the same patient contentment he always showed, seemingly untroubled by the complications that had suddenly entered his companion's life. It was Fenwick himself who ultimately pushed her toward a decision, whining insistently at the door the following morning, his old body straining against the familiar routine he had known for years, a routine that had suddenly been disrupted by concerns he could not understand, and Elena had not yet found the strength to explain to him, had such explanation even been possible. "You miss him too, don't you?" she murmured, kneeling beside the old wolf and pressing her forehead gently against his graying fur. "Even blind and unable to see who he truly is, you trusted him from that very first moment." Fenwick's tail thumped softly against the floor in response, and Elena found herself smiling, despite the tangled complexity of her emotions, recognizing in that simple gesture a wisdom that transcended human concerns about names and titles and the careful deceptions that seemed to accompany positions of power. She fastened his leash and stepped out into the cold morning air, telling herself only that she would walk their usual path, nothing more, that she owed neither explanation nor decision to anyone beyond the simple needs of the wolf who had depended upon her faithful care for so many years. The forest felt different that morning, charged with an uncertainty she had never experienced during their previous walks, every shadow seeming to hold new significance, now that she understood the genuine danger that had followed Edmund into these familiar woods. She kept her hand near her father's old knife, her senses alert in ways they had never needed to be before, and found herself, despite her lingering anger, grateful for whatever protection Alistair's discreet presence continued to offer. She reached the clearing to find Edmund already waiting, though he made no move toward her, seemingly understanding that whatever distance remained between them needed to be closed by her own choice rather than his approach. "You came," he said simply, relief evident in his voice, despite his careful restraint. "Fenwick needed his walk," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized their inadequacy as an explanation for why she had chosen, ultimately, to return to this clearing, rather than continuing to avoid it. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything left unsaid, hanging heavy in the cool morning air, before Elena finally spoke again, her voice quieter now, less guarded than it had been in the note she had struggled to compose in response to his own. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the careful, measured version you might offer a stranger, but the full truth, however difficult it may be to hear." Edmund nodded slowly, and over the following hour, as they walked together through the familiar paths that had once felt so simple and now carried such complicated weight, he told her everything. He spoke of his father's death and his own hurried coronation, of the crushing weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives beyond his own, of Grendel's death, and the emptiness that had followed, an emptiness that had first drawn him to this forest, seeking nothing more than temporary escape from burdens he had never fully learned to carry with ease. He spoke, too, of Duke Cassian Thorne, of the ambitions that had simmered beneath the surface of the Duke's public loyalty for years, and of Bramwell's growing suspicion that Thorne now sought to exploit knowledge of their forest meetings for his own political advantage, or worse, as justification for far more direct action against the crown. "The arrow," Elena said slowly, as the pieces continued to align within her understanding. "You believe Thorne is responsible." "I cannot yet confirm it with certainty," Edmund admitted, "but the evidence Alistair discovered on the ridge, combined with Thorne's inquiries into my identity, suggests a pattern too deliberate to ignore. If Thorne has discovered our connection, Elena, he may see you as a means of reaching me, whether through direct harm or through the scandal that would follow should our meetings become public knowledge." Elena absorbed this information slowly, the fear that had been building since Alistair's warning, finally finding concrete shape within a threat she could now name, even if she still could not fully comprehend its scope. "What does he want, this Duke?" "Power," Edmund said simply. "The throne his father believed rightfully belonged to their family. He has spent years cultivating allies among the nobility, building toward some eventual challenge to my rule, though he has always maintained careful public deference, never giving the council sufficient reason to act against him directly. And now he believes he has found a weakness he can exploit," Elena said, understanding settling over her with grim clarity. "Me. I will not allow him to harm you," Edmund said, his voice carrying a fierce protectiveness that surprised even himself with its intensity. "Whatever consequences this connection between us may bring, I will not permit you to suffer for my own failure to properly protect this secret." Elena studied him for a long moment, the anger she had carried since his revelation, slowly giving way to something more complicated, a recognition that the danger now surrounding them both had grown far beyond simple questions of trust or deception, into something that threatened her very safety, regardless of how she chose to feel about the truth he had finally shared. "I am frightened," she admitted quietly, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "Not simply of Thorne, though the thought of his ambitions certainly troubles me. I am frightened of what it means to matter to a king, to have my safety now tangled with matters of succession and power that I never asked to be part of." "I understand," Edmund said gently, "and if you wish to end our meetings entirely, to return to the life you knew before I first rode into this forest, I will respect that choice, however much it may pain me to accept it. Alistair will continue to ensure your safety regardless, and I will find some way to address the threat Thorne poses, without further endangering you." Elena considered his words carefully, watching Fenwick as the old wolf wandered a short distance away, nose lifted to catch some interesting scent carried on the morning breeze, entirely unaware of the momentous decision his companion now weighed within the clearing they had shared so many times before. "I do not wish to end our meetings," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "Whatever danger this connection brings, I find I am not prepared to simply walk away from what we have built together these past weeks. But I need you to promise me something, Edmund." It was the first time she had used his true name, and something in the sound of it, spoken with such deliberate intention, struck him with unexpected force. "Anything," he said. "No more secrets," she said. "Whatever comes, whatever danger we face together, I need honesty between us, complete and unguarded. I have already lost my father, already learned how quickly certainty can be stripped away by circumstances beyond my control. I cannot bear to build something meaningful upon foundations that might crumble again the moment another hidden truth emerges. I promise," Edmund said, and the solemnity in his voice left no doubt as to his sincerity. "No more secrets, Elena. Whatever I learn, Whatever threats emerge, you will know the truth of it as soon as I do. It was in that moment, as they stood together in the quiet clearing, with their renewed understanding settling between them like a fragile but genuine peace, that Fenwick's sudden, sharp bark shattered the stillness of the morning. Elena turned quickly, her heart lurching at the unmistakable alarm in her old wolf's voice, and saw him standing rigid near the edge of the clearing, his blind eyes fixed toward the northern tree line, every muscle in his aging body coiled with tension. "Someone's there," Edmund said, his hand already moving toward his sword, his entire demeanor shifting instantly, from the vulnerable honesty of moments before, into the alert readiness of a man well accustomed to facing genuine danger. A figure emerged from the trees, moving with the deliberate confidence of someone who had chosen this moment of exposure quite intentionally, rather than being caught unaware. He was dressed in dark, unmarked clothing, his face partially obscured by a low hood, but the bow he carried, drawn and ready, left little doubt as to his purpose. "Your Majesty," the man said, his voice carrying a mocking formality that made clear he already knew exactly who stood before him, despite Edmund's continued attempts at anonymity. "How fortunate to finally find you so far from your guards. Who sent you?" Edmund demanded, positioning himself instinctively between the archer and Elena, his sword now fully drawn despite the evident disadvantage of facing a ready bow with only a blade. The archer's mouth curved into a thin smile beneath his hood. "That hardly matters now, does it? What matters is that you have made yourself remarkably easy to find, riding alone into these woods morning after morning, distracted by whatever comfort this village woman offers you." Elena felt Fenwick press hard against her legs, his growl deep and constant now, every instinct in his aging body focused entirely on the threat before them despite his inability to see it clearly. She kept her hand on the old wolf's back, drawing what strength she could from his steady presence, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her own composure. "You will not harm her," Edmund said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire clearing, despite the evident danger of his position. "Whatever quarrel you or your master holds with me, she has done nothing to warrant your attention." "Perhaps," the archer said, his aim shifting slightly, though whether toward Edmund or Elena remained uncertain in the tense stillness of the moment. "Or perhaps she has simply become the most effective means of ensuring your full attention, Your Majesty. A king distracted by fear for someone he cares for makes far more mistakes than one who fears only for himself." Before either Edmund or Elena could respond further, a sudden movement from the tree line behind the archer drew Elena's attention, and she watched with a rush of desperate hope as Alistair emerged silently from his hidden position, his own bow already drawn and aimed with practiced precision at the threat that had positioned itself so confidently within the clearing. "Drop your weapon," Alistair called out, his voice steady despite the evident tension of the moment, "or I will not hesitate to loose this arrow before you have the chance to loose your own." The archer's confidence flickered, just slightly, as he registered the presence of a second threat he had evidently failed to account for in whatever plan had brought him to this clearing. His eyes darted between Edmund, Elena, and the now visible guard who threatened his own position with equal readiness. For a long, breathless moment, the entire clearing seemed to hold its breath. Four figures locked in a tense standoff whose outcome would determine far more than simply who survived the next several seconds, but the entire trajectory of a kingdom, already balanced precariously between loyalty and ambition, between the quiet peace Elena and Edmund had tried desperately to preserve, and the dangerous machinations of a duke determined to claim a throne he believed rightfully belonged to his own family. The archer's eyes flicked once more between his two targets, calculating odds that had shifted dramatically against him in the span of a few heartbeats, before he made his decision, releasing his bowstring, not toward Edmund or Elena, but toward Alistair, the only figure whose readied weapon posed genuine immediate threat to his own survival. Alistair twisted aside with the reflexive speed of extensive training, the arrow grazing his shoulder rather than finding a more fatal mark, and in the chaos of that moment, the archer turned and fled into the dense cover of the northern trees, moving with a speed and familiarity with the terrain that suggested extensive prior preparation for exactly this kind of hasty retreat. "Stay with her," Alistair called back toward Edmund, already moving in pursuit despite the injury to his shoulder. "I will not let him escape entirely." Edmund hesitated only a moment, torn between his duty to protect Elena and his desire to ensure the archer did not escape to report back to whoever had sent him, before deciding that Elena's safety took absolute priority over any information they might gain through capturing their attacker. "Are you harmed?" he asked urgently, turning to Elena, who stood pale but steady, one hand still resting on Fenwick's back, the old wolf's growl finally beginning to subside now that the immediate threat had fled the clearing. "I am unharmed," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "But Edmund, that man knew exactly who you were. He called you by your title without hesitation." "Yes," Edmund said grimly, sheathing his sword, though his body remained tense with lingering alertness. "Which confirms my worst suspicions. Whoever sent him already knows precisely what he risked, sending an assassin after a king, rather than simply a stranger who happened to frequent these woods." They waited in tense silence for nearly 20 minutes, before Alistair finally returned, his shoulder bandaged hastily with a strip of cloth torn from his own tunic, his expression grim with the evident frustration of failure. "He escaped, Your Majesty," Alistair reported, though I managed to track him far enough to confirm he met with a second rider, waiting just beyond the forest's edge, along the road leading toward Thorne's estates. The confirmation, though not entirely unexpected given their growing suspicions, still settled over the small group with heavy finality. Whatever doubt might have remained about Thorne's involvement had now been effectively erased, replaced by the far more urgent question of how they should respond to an attack that had moved beyond mere suspicion into open, if deniable, aggression. "We must return to the palace immediately," Edmund said, his mind already racing through the political complexities of confronting a duke as powerful and carefully positioned as Thorne, without sufficient concrete evidence to justify direct accusation before the full council. "Bramwell must be informed of everything that occurred here." "And Elena?" Alistair asked, glancing toward the young woman who remained standing quietly beside her wolf, absorbing the rapid shift in circumstances with a composure that belied the genuine fear still evident in her eyes. "She cannot remain in the village unprotected," Edmund said firmly, "not now that Thorne has demonstrated a willingness to send armed men directly into these woods." "I will not simply abandon my home," Elena said, though her tone carried more resignation than genuine protest, understanding already settling over her that circumstances had moved far beyond her ability to simply continue her previous quiet life, undisturbed by the dangers now gathering around her connection to the king. "I am not asking you to abandon it permanently," Edmund said gently, "only to accept protection sufficient to ensure your safety, while we address the threat Thorne now poses. Bramwell can arrange quarters within the palace grounds, discreet enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention, until we have resolved this matter definitively." Elena looked down at Fenwick, who had settled beside her feet now that the immediate danger had passed, his blind eyes still turned toward the direction the archer had fled, as though some lingering instinct continued to track the threat long after it had physically departed the clearing. "And Fenwick?" she asked. "He cannot simply be left behind, and I fear the unfamiliar environment of a palace might prove difficult for him, given his age and his blindness." "He will accompany you, of course," Edmund said, and something in the immediate certainty of his answer suggested he had never truly considered any alternative. "I would not ask you to leave behind the companion who first drew my attention to your quiet courage in that very first meeting." Elena managed a small, weary smile at that. The first genuine warmth she had shown since the archer's sudden appearance had shattered the fragile peace of their earlier reconciliation. "Very well," she said. "I will accept your protection, though I hope this arrangement proves temporary rather than permanent. My life has always been simple, Edmund, and I confess I have little experience with palace politics or the elaborate customs that likely govern such places." "You need not concern yourself with palace customs," Edmund said. "Only with your own safety, until we have properly addressed the threat that now surrounds us both." They made their way back toward the palace, with considerably more caution than either Edmund or Elena had exercised during their previous morning meetings, Alistair scouting ahead at regular intervals to ensure no further ambush awaited them along the route. The journey passed without further incident, though the tension of the morning's events lingered heavily over the small group throughout their careful progress. Bramwell met them at the palace gates, his expression shifting rapidly from formal composure to genuine alarm as he registered Alistair's visible injury and the evident distress still lingering across both Edmund's and Elena's features. "What happened?" he demanded, ushering them quickly through the gates and away from the more public areas of the palace grounds, where servants and courtiers might observe their unusual arrival. Edmund provided a rapid summary as they made their way toward his private study, detailing the archer's appearance, his explicit knowledge of Edmund's identity, and Alistair's subsequent discovery of the second rider waiting near Thorne's estates. Bramwell listened with growing grimness, his jaw tightening progressively throughout the account, until, by its conclusion, his expression carried the hardened resolve of a man who understood precisely what such an attack ultimately signified. "This changes everything," Bramwell said once Edmund had finished. An arrow loosed near a clearing might be dismissed as accident or coincidence, however unlikely such an explanation seemed even at the time. But this, an armed man directly confronting you, explicitly acknowledging your identity, this is unambiguous. Thorne has moved beyond mere positioning and suspicion, into open, if deniable, treason. We have no direct proof connecting him to the archer beyond Alistair's observation of a second rider near his estates, Edmund pointed out. Thorne will simply deny any knowledge of the man, will claim the rider's presence near his lands proves nothing beyond coincidental proximity. Then we must find proof that cannot be so easily dismissed, Bramwell said. I will begin a discreet investigation immediately, questioning the estate staff, examining Thorne's recent movements and associations. We must move carefully, Your Majesty, given his considerable influence among certain factions of the nobility, but we cannot allow this attack to pass without proper consequence. And Elena? Edmund asked, his concern for her safety remaining foremost, despite the broader political complications now demanding his attention. I will arrange quarters within the eastern wing, Bramwell said, quarters positioned discreetly enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention from the wider court, while still ensuring adequate protection given the current circumstances. It will require some explanation for her presence, of course, but I can construct a suitable cover story, perhaps presenting her as a distant relation visiting from the countryside. Elena, who had remained largely silent throughout this rapid exchange of political strategy, finally spoke, her voice carrying a quiet determination that drew both men's attention. I appreciate your protection, truly, but I would ask that whatever arrangement is made, it does not require me to abandon Fenwick's needs entirely, for the sake of appearances. He requires his morning walks, regardless of where those walks might now need to occur. Bramwell studied her for a moment, something like respect flickering across his usually guarded expression. The eastern gardens should provide sufficient space for his needs, and are private enough to avoid unnecessary exposure. I will ensure the arrangement accommodates him properly. Thank you, Elena said, offering a small, grateful nod. As the practical arrangements for her temporary residence within the palace were finalized over the following hour, Edmund found himself reflecting on how dramatically circumstances had shifted since that first morning weeks ago, when he had ridden into the forest seeking nothing more than temporary escape from the burdens of his crown. What had begun as a simple, if unusual, friendship had grown into something far more consequential, entangled now with matters of succession, treason, and a duke's dangerous ambition that threatened not only his own safety, but that of the young woman whose quiet courage had first drawn his attention. He resolved, as Elena settled into her new, if temporary quarters that evening, that he would not allow Thorne's ambitions to succeed, whatever cost that resolution might ultimately demand. The Duke had chosen to threaten not only his king, but an innocent woman who had done nothing beyond offering genuine friendship to a man she had believed, for weeks, to be nothing more than a simple traveler seeking peace in a quiet forest. That evening, as Elena settled Fenwick into an unfamiliar but comfortable corner of her new palace quarters, she found herself thinking not of the danger that had brought her here, but of the strange, unexpected turns her life had taken since that first arrow had struck the tree beside her, weeks ago, in a clearing she had once considered entirely her own private sanctuary. She did not yet know how this growing conflict with Duke Thorne would ultimately resolve, did not yet know whether the fragile trust she had rebuilt with Edmund following his revelation would prove strong enough to withstand whatever further trials lay ahead. But as she settled beside Fenwick, feeling his steady breathing beneath her hand, she found a measure of quiet resolve settling over her own uncertain heart. Whatever came next, she would face it, as she had faced every difficulty in her life before now, with the same patient courage that had once led her to rescue a half-blind, half-starved wolf pup from certain death, near an abandoned quarry, refusing to abandon a creature others had deemed unworthy of saving. If that same stubborn determination could carry a blind wolf through years of contented life, she trusted it could carry her through whatever challenges Duke Thorne's ambitions might yet bring to both her own life and the kingdom she had never expected to become entangled within so completely. Nearly a week passed before Bramwell finally uncovered evidence substantial enough to move forward with formal action against Duke Thorne, a week during which Elena settled uneasily into palace life, torn between gratitude for the safety her new quarters provided and a persistent longing for the simple routines of her village home. Bramwell's investigation had proceeded carefully, methodically, drawing upon a network of informants he had cultivated over many years of service to the crown. He questioned stable hands and kitchen staff from Thorne's estates, cross-referenced travel records and financial transactions, and slowly assembled a picture that left little doubt as to the Duke's involvement in the attack that had occurred in the forest clearing. The breakthrough came through a young stable boy at Thorne's estate, a boy who had witnessed a rider matching the archer's description arriving late one evening, exhausted and injured, seeking immediate treatment for a wound that matched precisely the graze Alistair had inflicted during their confrontation. The boy, frightened but ultimately persuaded by Bramwell's careful questioning and the promise of protection, should his testimony ever become necessary, confirmed that the rider had been received directly by Thorne himself, away from the notice of the estate's other staff. "It is not yet conclusive proof before the full council," Bramwell explained to Edmund, as they reviewed the gathered evidence within the privacy of the king's study. But combined with Alistair's own testimony regarding the second rider's proximity to Thorne's lands, and the financial records showing unusual payments to individuals not otherwise accounted for within his household staff, I believe we have sufficient grounds to bring formal charges. Edmund studied the assembled evidence carefully, his expression grim but resolute. Thorne will not accept these charges without significant resistance. He has spent years cultivating allies among the council, allies who may prove reluctant to convict a duke of his standing, without evidence that leaves absolutely no room for alternative explanation. "I am aware of the difficulty," Bramwell acknowledged, "but continued inaction poses greater risk than proceeding now, particularly given how directly he has already threatened your safety, and Elena's. We cannot afford to wait for further attacks before finally addressing the threat he poses." Edmund nodded slowly, though a persistent unease continued to gnaw at him, a sense that Thorne, having already demonstrated such calculated patience in building toward this moment, would not simply accept defeat without attempting some final, desperate action to preserve his ambitions. That unease proved prophetic sooner than either man anticipated. It was late that same evening, as Elena prepared Fenwick for his final walk of the day through the quiet eastern gardens that had become their temporary substitute for the forest paths she still missed, that the first sign of trouble emerged. Fenwick, usually calm during these evening walks, suddenly stiffened, his old body going rigid with the same alarm Elena had learned to recognize during their confrontation with the archer weeks before. She froze immediately, scanning the shadowed garden paths around her, her hand instinctively moving toward the knife she now carried at all times, regardless of how safe the palace grounds were meant to be. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice carrying more confidence than she genuinely felt in that moment. No response came, only the soft rustle of wind through the carefully manicured hedges surrounding the garden path. Elena took a cautious step backward, preparing to retreat toward the safety of her quarters, when a hand suddenly closed roughly over her mouth from behind, another arm wrapping tightly around her waist, lifting her off her feet with startling strength before she could fully process what was happening. Fenwick lunged immediately, his teeth finding purchase on her attacker's leg despite his blindness. Guided entirely by instinct and the sound of Elena's muffled struggle, the man cursed sharply, kicking out at the old wolf with enough force to send him tumbling aside, though Fenwick recovered quickly, his growl deepening into something far more menacing than Elena had ever heard from him before. "Quiet the beast," a second voice ordered from somewhere nearby, and Elena's blood ran cold as she recognized the calculated coldness in the tone, a voice entirely unfamiliar yet somehow exactly what she might have expected from a man capable of ordering an assassination attempt against his own king. "Duke Thorne," she managed to gasp out, despite the hand still pressed firmly over her mouth, the words muffled but clear enough for the intended recipient to understand. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and immaculately dressed despite the late hour, his expression carrying none of the frantic desperation Elena might have expected from a man whose treasonous plans had recently begun unraveling. Instead, Thorn regarded her with something closer to detached curiosity, as though she represented merely a useful tool, rather than a person whose fear and pain held any genuine significance to him. "You have caused me considerable inconvenience, young woman," Thorn said, his voice carrying the smooth, cultured tones of extensive noble breeding. "The king has grown remarkably distracted since first encountering you in that forest, distracted enough to finally begin questioning my own careful positioning at court, an investigation I understand Lord Bramwell has been conducting with rather alarming thoroughness these past several days." Elena struggled against the man restraining her, though his grip remained unyielding, his strength considerably greater than her own desperate attempts to break free. Fenwick continued to growl, positioning himself protectively between Elena and Thorn, though the second man kept the old wolf at bay, with a sword drawn threateningly close to his throat. "You will accompany me quietly," Thorn continued, "or your wolf's throat will find considerably less mercy than you might hope for. I have no particular desire to harm an innocent animal, but I will not hesitate to do so if it ensures your cooperation." Elena's eyes widened with genuine fear at the threat, and though every instinct urged continued resistance, she forced herself to still her struggling, recognizing the futility of further defiance against such clearly stated consequences. "Good," Thorn said, satisfaction evident in his tone. "Bring her. The wolf can be dealt with once we are clear of the grounds." "No," Elena managed to gasp out, despite the hand still partially covering her mouth, genuine desperation entering her voice. "Please, he is old, he is blind, he poses no threat to anyone." Thorn studied her for a moment, something almost like curiosity flickering across his composed features. "You would plead for a wolf's life, even while your own remains at genuine risk. How curious. Perhaps I understand now why the king finds you so compelling." He gestured dismissively toward the second man. "Leave the creature. He can hardly follow us far in his condition, and I have little interest in cruelty for its own sake, whatever necessity may require of me tonight." Elena felt a small measure of relief at this concession, even as the man restraining her began moving her forcibly toward the garden's outer wall, where a small, discreet gate led toward the palace's less guarded perimeter. She twisted her head enough to catch a final glimpse of Fenwick, standing confused and distressed near where she had been taken, his blind eyes turned uselessly in every direction as he tried desperately to track the sounds of her continued struggle. "I'm sorry," she managed to whisper, though she doubted the old wolf could hear or understand the apology, before her captors pulled her fully through the gate and into the darkness beyond the palace grounds. Fenwick, left alone in the garden, did not simply retreat or wait passively for someone to discover his distress. Instead, guided by instincts far older and more reliable than his failing eyesight, he began to track the fading scent of Elena's passage, his nose lowered to the ground as he followed the path her captors had taken, moving with a determination that belied his advanced age and physical limitations. It was nearly 20 minutes later that a palace guard, making his routine rounds through the eastern gardens, discovered the old wolf pacing frantically near the outer gate, whining and scratching at the locked barrier, with an urgency that immediately signaled something was gravely wrong. The guard, recognizing Fenwick as belonging to the king's recent guest, quickly alerted his superiors, and within minutes, the alarm had spread throughout the palace, reaching Edmund and Bramwell as they continued reviewing evidence within the king's study, entirely unaware of how dramatically circumstances had shifted while they had focused their attention on building a case against a duke who had apparently decided to act far more directly than either man had anticipated. "She's gone," the guard reported breathlessly, having rushed directly to the king's chambers upon hearing the alarm's origin. "Her wolf was found alone near the eastern garden gate, distressed and clearly searching for her, but there's no sign of the young woman herself." Edmund's blood ran cold, every fear he had carried since first learning of Thorn's involvement in the earlier attack, suddenly crystallizing into horrifying reality. "Thorn," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "He has moved against her directly." "We must act immediately," Bramwell said, already moving toward the door, his usual careful composure giving way to genuine urgency. "If he has taken her, He likely intends to use her as leverage against you, or worse, as means of drawing you into a trap, where he might finally accomplish what his archer failed to achieve in the forest. Edmund followed swiftly, his mind racing through possibilities even as guards began mobilizing throughout the palace grounds, searching for any trace of where Elena might have been taken. It was Fenwick, ultimately, who provided their first genuine lead, the old wolf continuing to strain against his restraint near the garden gate, his nose still tracking the fading scent trail that led toward the darker outskirts of the palace grounds. He knows the way she was taken, Edmund realized, watching the wolf's insistent behavior with growing understanding. Release him. Let him lead us. The guard hesitated only briefly before complying, and Fenwick immediately surged forward, moving with a speed and determination that seemed to defy both his age and his blindness. Guided entirely by scent and instinct, as he led the growing search party through the garden gate and into the darkness beyond, following a trail that Edmund fervently hoped would lead them to Elena before Thorn's ambitions could claim a final, irreversible victory. They moved swiftly through the darkened countryside surrounding the palace, Fenwick's insistent pace never wavering despite the growing distance and the rougher terrain that lay beyond the carefully maintained palace grounds. Edmund rode alongside Bramwell and a contingent of the palace's most trusted guards, his heart pounding with a fear more intense than any he had experienced even during the direct confrontation with the archer weeks before. This was different, he realized, this fear that gripped him now. The earlier danger had threatened his own safety, a risk he had accepted as an inevitable part of his position since childhood. But this threat targeted Elena, a woman who had done nothing beyond offering him genuine friendship and honesty, a woman now suffering because of her unfortunate connection to a king who had failed to properly protect her from the consequences of his own carelessness. Fenwick's trail led them, after nearly an hour of tense pursuit, toward an abandoned mill, situated along the banks of a small river, some distance from the palace, a structure Bramwell recognized immediately as property once belonging to Thorn's family, though it had fallen into disuse decades before, following a dispute over water rights with neighboring landowners. This is likely where he intends to hold her, Bramwell said quietly, as the search party paused at a safe distance from the mill, assessing the structure for signs of occupation. Dim light flickered from within, visible through gaps in the aging wooden walls, confirming that someone indeed remained inside, despite the building's otherwise abandoned appearance. Edmund's jaw tightened with grim resolve. We move carefully. Thorn will not hesitate to use Elena as a shield should he sense our approach, and I will not risk her safety through hasty action. They spread out silently around the mill's perimeter, guards positioning themselves to prevent any potential escape, while Edmund and Bramwell approached the main entrance, with careful, deliberate caution. Fenwick pressed close against Edmund's leg, his growl now a constant, low rumble that betrayed his continued awareness of the danger that awaited them within. Whatever confrontation lay ahead, within the flickering shadows of that abandoned mill, would determine far more than simply Elena's immediate safety. It would determine whether Thorn's carefully constructed ambitions finally collapsed entirely beneath the weight of his own desperate overreach, or whether his final, dangerous gamble might yet succeed in claiming a victory that would reshape the kingdom's future in ways neither Edmund nor Bramwell were prepared to fully accept. Inside the mill, Elena sat bound to an old wooden chair, her wrists chafing against coarse rope, watching Thorn pace before her with the restless energy of a man whose carefully constructed plans had begun unraveling faster than he had anticipated. "Your king will come," Thorn muttered, more to himself than to her, his composed exterior finally beginning to crack under the pressure of circumstances that had clearly moved beyond his original calculations. "He will come, and when he does, he will finally understand the cost of underestimating my resolve." "He will also bring guards," Elena said, finding a measure of steady courage despite her genuine fear, "and evidence sufficient to see you properly tried for treason, evidence that will only grow stronger the longer you continue this reckless course." Thorn's eyes flashed with sudden anger, and he crossed the room quickly, gripping her chin roughly, to force her attention fully upon him. "You understand nothing of what is truly at stake here, girl. My family's claim to this throne was stolen generations ago, dismissed by a council, too cowardly to properly honor legitimate succession. I will not simply accept that same injustice as my own inheritance. Stealing a king's peace, threatening innocent lives. This is not the path toward legitimate claim to anything, Elena said, her voice steady, despite the tremor she could not fully suppress. Whatever grievance your family carries, this path leads only toward your own destruction, not toward any throne. Thorn released her chin abruptly, turning away with visible frustration, though before he could respond further, the mill's heavy wooden door suddenly burst open, revealing Edmund standing in the threshold, sword drawn, his expression carrying a fury Elena had never witnessed from him before. "Release her, Thorn," Edmund commanded, his voice carrying an authority that filled the entire structure despite its considerable size. "This ends now." Thorn straightened, some remnant of his careful composure, reasserting itself, even as the guards positioned behind Edmund made clear how thoroughly his plans had already collapsed. "Your Majesty," he said, with a mocking formality that did nothing to disguise the desperation now evident beneath his forced calm. "How predictable that you would rush so recklessly into danger for the sake of a common village woman." "Uncommon courage deserves recognition, regardless of birth," Edmund said, taking a measured step forward, his eyes never leaving Thorn despite his evident desire to immediately free Elena from her restraints. "Something you might have learned, had ambition not consumed whatever honor your family once possessed." Thorn's hand moved swiftly toward a hidden blade at his belt, but before he could draw it fully, Fenwick surged forward from beside Edmund's legs, moving with a speed that belied his blindness and advanced age, his teeth finding purchase on Thorn's wrist with enough force to send the blade clattering uselessly to the mill's wooden floor. Thorn cried out in pain and surprise, stumbling backward as guards moved swiftly to secure him. The fight effectively ended before it had truly begun. Thorn's carefully constructed ambitions finally collapsing entirely beneath the combined resistance of a determined king, a loyal wolf, and a young woman whose courage had never wavered despite the genuine danger she had faced. Edmund rushed immediately to Elena's side, cutting through her restraints with careful, urgent movements, his hands trembling slightly with the aftermath of fear and relief in equal measure. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion he made no attempt to fully disguise. "I am unharmed," Elena said, though her voice carried the genuine exhaustion of everything she had endured throughout the evening's terrifying events. "Frightened, certainly, but unharmed." Fenwick pressed close against her the moment her hands were freed, and Elena wrapped her arms around the old wolf's neck, burying her face briefly against his familiar fur, drawing comfort from his steady presence, in a way that transcended any words she might have offered in that moment. "He led us here," Edmund said quietly, watching the reunion with evident emotion, "tracked your scent across nearly an hour of difficult terrain, refusing to abandon the search despite his age and his blindness." "Of course he did," Elena said, her voice thick with tears she no longer attempted to hold back. "He has never once abandoned me, not in all these years, and I suppose it should not surprise me that he refused to begin now, whatever danger such loyalty might have demanded of him." Behind them, guards secured Thorn's hands with sturdy manacles, the Duke's expression carrying a bitter resignation that suggested he understood, finally, the complete failure of ambitions he had nurtured for so many years. Bramwell approached, his expression carrying grim satisfaction, despite the exhaustion evident in his own bearing. "We have him, Your Majesty," Bramwell confirmed, caught in the very act of treason, with evidence now overwhelming enough that even his most loyal allies among the council will find it impossible to argue in his defense. "See that he is transported securely back to the palace," Edmund said, though his attention remained largely focused on Elena, his hand gently resting against her shoulder, as though reassuring himself of her genuine safety through simple, continued contact. "Formal charges will be brought before the full council at the earliest opportunity." As guards led Thorn away toward waiting horses, the former Duke cast one final glance back toward Edmund and Elena, his expression carrying a complex mixture of bitterness and something almost resembling grudging respect. "You have won this particular battle, Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier confidence. "But do not imagine that my family's grievance dies with my own capture. There will be others who remember the injustice done to us, others who may yet prove more careful in their own eventual challenge to your rule." "Perhaps," Edmund said, meeting the former Duke's gaze steadily, "but I will face whatever challenges come, Thorn, with far greater vigilance now than I once possessed. thanks to lessons this entire ordeal has taught me rather thoroughly." Thorn said nothing further, allowing himself to be led away in silence, and Edmund finally turned his full attention back toward Elena, helping her rise carefully from the chair where she had been bound for what had likely felt like an eternity of genuine fear. "Let us return home," he said gently, and something in his tone, the simple, unguarded warmth of it, suggested the word home, carried meaning far beyond the physical walls of the palace they would soon return to. The journey back proved considerably calmer than their earlier desperate pursuit, Fenwick trotting contentedly alongside Elena's horse, his earlier urgency finally giving way to the satisfied exhaustion of a task successfully completed. Elena rode close beside Edmund throughout the journey, saying little, though the comfortable silence between them carried none of the earlier tension that had characterized their relationship since his revelation of true identity weeks before. It was as the palace finally came into view, its towers silhouetted against the gradually lightening sky of approaching dawn, that Elena finally spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying genuine warmth. "Thank you," she said, "for coming for me, and for trusting Fenwick enough to follow his lead through unfamiliar terrain in the darkness." "I would have followed him to the ends of the earth, if that was what it took to find you," Edmund said, and the simple sincerity in his voice left no doubt as to the genuine depth of feeling behind the words. Elena studied him for a long moment, something shifting within her own understanding of everything that had transpired between them, since that first arrow had struck the tree beside her, weeks ago in a clearing that now felt impossibly distant from the complicated reality they currently navigated together. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I have finally come to fully trust the truth of who you are, Edmund. Not simply the king, with all the complications that title brings, but the man beneath it, the same man who first offered flowers to a stranger, without expectation of anything in return." Edmund's expression softened considerably at her words, relief and genuine happiness evident in every line of his weary features. "I am grateful beyond words to hear that," he said, "though I understand there remains much still to navigate, given everything that has occurred, and everything that likely still awaits us as we address the full consequences of Thorn's betrayal before the council." "Whatever challenges remain," Elena said, glancing down toward Fenwick, who continued trotting steadily alongside them despite the long night's exertions, "I trust we will face them, as we face tonight's danger, together, with whatever courage and loyalty we can each offer toward the other." As they finally passed through the palace gates, the first genuine light of dawn breaking across the eastern horizon, Edmund found himself reflecting on how thoroughly his life had transformed since first encountering a blind wolf and his devoted companion in a quiet forest clearing weeks before. What had begun as simple curiosity, a king's desperate search for peace amid overwhelming burdens, had grown into something far more significant, a connection tested severely by danger and deception alike, yet one that had ultimately proven strong enough to survive even the gravest threats Thorn's ambition had managed to construct against it. The road ahead remained uncertain, complicated further by the political fallout that would inevitably follow Thorn's formal trial, and the difficult questions his betrayal would raise regarding the loyalty of other nobles who had aligned themselves, however quietly, with his ambitions over the years. But for now, in this quiet moment of dawn light and genuine relief, Edmund found himself grateful simply for Elena's safety, and for the fragile but genuine trust they had managed to rebuild together, despite everything that had threatened to permanently sever the connection between them. The trial of Duke Cassian Thorn began 9 days later, held within the great council chamber, before an assembly of nobles, whose expressions ranged from genuine shock to carefully masked satisfaction at witnessing a rival's spectacular downfall. Bramwell had spent the intervening days building an unassailable case, gathering testimony from the stable boy at Thorn's estate, financial records documenting unusual payments, and Alistair's own account of the confrontation in the forest clearing. Elena, too, was called to testify regarding her abduction, an experience she approached with far greater composure than she had expected of herself, drawing strength from Fenwick's presence just outside the chamber doors and Edmund's steady support throughout the difficult proceedings. Thorn, for his part, offered little genuine defense beyond bitter accusations regarding the historical injustice done to his family's claim, accusations that found no sympathy among a council, largely relieved to see legitimate proof finally justify action against a nobleman whose ambitions had long simmered beneath careful public loyalty. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one. Thorn was stripped of his title and lands, his considerable holdings redistributed among families who had remained genuinely loyal throughout the crisis, and he himself was sentenced to permanent exile from the kingdom's borders, a punishment Edmund had personally advocated for, over more severe alternatives, recognizing that continued imprisonment might simply provide a rallying point for whatever remaining sympathizers Thorn's cause still commanded among the disaffected nobility. But even as the formal proceedings concluded, delivering what should have felt like a definitive resolution to the danger that had threatened Edmund and Elena for so many difficult weeks, an unexpected complication emerged that neither Bramwell nor Edmund had fully anticipated. Thorn's closest ally, a lesser nobleman named Garrick Aldwyn, who had served as the Duke's most trusted confidant throughout his years of careful political maneuvering, had escaped the initial arrests entirely, having been absent from the estate during the crucial night of Elena's abduction due to business in a distant province. Upon learning of Thorn's capture and impending trial, Garrick had not simply fled into obscurity as most rational men might have chosen, but had instead resolved upon one final desperate action, believing that removing Edmund entirely, even now, might yet salvage something from Thorn's collapsed ambitions by throwing the kingdom into the very succession crisis that had originally fueled the Thorn family's grievance. The council chamber had barely begun dispersing following the trial's conclusion when the first sign of Garrick's desperate plan became evident, a sudden commotion near the chamber's main entrance, drawing immediate alarm from the assembled guards. "Fire!" someone shouted from beyond the chamber doors. "Fire! In the eastern corridor!" Confusion rippled through the departing nobles as smoke began drifting visibly through the chamber's open doors, and Bramwell's expression shifted immediately, from relief at the trial's successful conclusion to renewed alarm, recognizing instinctively that such convenient timing suggested deliberate action rather than genuine accident. "This is no accident," he said urgently to Edmund, already moving to position himself protectively near the king. "Someone means to use this chaos as cover for further action against you." Edmund's hand moved instinctively toward his sword, his eyes scanning the increasingly chaotic chamber as nobles and guards alike began moving toward exits, the growing smoke creating genuine confusion that could easily mask a more targeted threat within its cover. "Elena," Edmund said urgently, searching for her among the dispersing crowd, relief flooding through him as he spotted her near the chamber's side entrance. Fenwick pressed close against her legs despite the general chaos, the old wolf's heightened senses clearly registering danger that transcended simple confusion about the smoke's origin. He moved quickly toward her, Bramwell following close behind with several guards, but before he could reach her position, a figure emerged suddenly from the drifting smoke near the chamber's northern wall, sword drawn, moving with the desperate speed of a man who understood this represented his final, best opportunity to accomplish what Thorn's more careful plans had ultimately failed to achieve. "Garrick," Bramwell said, recognizing the man immediately, despite the smoke's obscuring haze. "Stand down. This ends here." But Garrick showed no sign of heeding the warning, his eyes fixed entirely on Edmund, with the singular focus of a man who had abandoned all rational calculation in favor of desperate, final action. He surged forward, sword raised, moving with a speed that left the surrounding guards insufficient time to properly intervene, before he had closed the distance, separating himself from the king. Edmund raised his own blade just in time to deflect the initial strike, the force of the impact reverberating painfully through his arm, but Garrick pressed his advantage immediately, his desperation lending him a reckless intensity that made his attacks difficult to predict or counter effectively. Elena watched in genuine horror as the two men exchanged rapid, dangerous blows, the surrounding guards unable to safely intervene, given how closely the combatants had positioned themselves, any misstep risking harm to Edmund rather than his attacker. Fenwick, sensing her distress and the genuine danger unfolding nearby, strained against her restraining grip, his growl deepening into something fierce and protective. It was in that moment of genuine peril, as Garrick's blade came dangerously close to finding its mark against Edmund's unprotected side, that Fenwick finally broke free from Elena's grasp entirely, surging forward through the smoke and chaos, with a speed that defied every limitation his age and blindness should have imposed upon him. The old wolf's teeth found purchase on Garrick's sword arm with tremendous force, the sudden, unexpected attack throwing off the nobleman's balance at precisely the critical moment, his blade deflecting harmlessly wide of Edmund's body as he stumbled backward under the wolf's fierce assault. Edmund seized the opportunity immediately, his own blade finding its mark against Garrick's now exposed defense, and within moments, the guards had finally managed to close the distance, securing the wounded nobleman firmly despite his continued futile struggle against their restraint. "It's over," Bramwell said firmly, watching as guards dragged Garrick away, the man's earlier desperate fury giving way finally to bitter resignation at his own plan's spectacular failure. "The fire has been contained as well, Your Majesty, deliberately set, as we suspected, though the damage appears limited to a single storage corridor." Edmund lowered his sword slowly, his chest heaving with the aftermath of adrenaline and genuine relief, before turning immediately toward Elena, who rushed forward the moment the immediate danger had passed, kneeling beside Fenwick to check the old wolf for any injury sustained during his fierce, unexpected intervention. "He's unharmed," she confirmed, relief evident in her voice as she ran careful hands along Fenwick's fur, finding no wound despite the ferocity of his brief but decisive attack. "Though I confess, I did not expect such courage from him, even after everything he has already shown us these past weeks." "Nor did I," Edmund said, kneeling beside her to offer his own grateful attention to the old wolf, who accepted the combined affection of both humans, with the same patient contentment he had always shown, seemingly unbothered by the danger he had just faced, despite his advanced years and physical limitations. "Though I suppose I should have expected nothing less, given everything he has already demonstrated about the true nature of loyalty and courage." In the days that followed, as the palace slowly returned to a more settled rhythm, following the dual crises of Thorne's trial and Garrick's desperate final attack, Edmund found himself reflecting deeply on everything the past several weeks had taught him, not only about the political dangers that had threatened his kingdom, but about the genuine value of connection and trust that transcended the careful calculations and constant vigilance his position typically demanded. Bramwell completed a thorough investigation into any remaining sympathizers who might have supported Thorne's ambitions, finding, to considerable relief, that the majority of nobles who had once maintained careful alliance with the disgraced duke quickly distanced themselves entirely from his cause, unwilling to risk their own positions, given how thoroughly his plans had ultimately collapsed. The kingdom, though shaken by the revelation of such significant betrayal within its highest ranks, gradually settled back into stability, its council reformed, with additional safeguards against future concentration of ambition among any single noble house. Elena, meanwhile, found herself increasingly uncertain about her own future, torn between the quiet life she had known in Ashford Hollow and the complicated, though undeniably meaningful, connection she had built with a king whose position demanded considerations far beyond simple personal preference or affection. It was Edmund himself who finally broached the difficult question, nearly 2 weeks after Garrick's failed final attack, as they walked together through the palace's private gardens in the quiet hours of early evening, Fenwick trotting contentedly beside them, seemingly fully recovered from the exertions and dangers of recent weeks. "I know you have not yet decided what comes next," Edmund said carefully, "whether you wish to return to your village life, or whether you might consider remaining here, within circumstances that would inevitably grow far more complicated than the quiet mornings we once shared in that forest clearing." Elena considered his words carefully, watching Fenwick as he paused to investigate some interesting scent along the garden path, entirely unbothered by the significant conversation unfolding around him. "I have thought of little else these past weeks," she admitted. "My village life was simple, Edmund, predictable in ways I once found genuinely comforting. But I have also come to understand, through everything we have faced together, that simplicity was never truly what I sought from my mornings in that forest. I sought connection, genuine and honest, the kind I found first with Fenwick, and then, unexpectedly, with you. And do you believe you have found that connection, despite everything the truth of my position has demanded of us both?" Edmund asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability rarely evident in his more formal public bearing. "I believe I have," Elena said softly, "though I confess the prospect of navigating palace life, of learning customs and expectations entirely foreign to everything I have known before now, remains genuinely daunting." "You need not navigate it alone," Edmund said, stopping their walk entirely to face her directly, his expression carrying a sincerity that left no doubt as to the genuine depth of feeling behind his words. Whatever challenges palace life may present, I would consider it the greatest honor of my reign to help you navigate them, should you choose to remain. Elena studied him for a long moment, the weight of the decision before her settling with genuine significance, before she finally allowed herself a small, warm smile that answered his question more clearly than any words might have managed. Then perhaps, she said, it is time I considered Ashford Hollow less as my permanent home, and more as the place where this particular story truly began. Winter arrived gently that year, softening the palace grounds beneath a quiet blanket of snow that Elena had come to appreciate in ways she had never fully noticed during her years in Ashford Hollow, where survival through the cold months had always demanded far more practical attention than admiration. She had settled, over the intervening months, into a life she could not have imagined for herself. That first morning she led Fenwick along the forest path, unaware that a king rode somewhere nearby, drawn by curiosity and grief, toward a scene of simple devotion that would eventually reshape both their lives so completely. The palace, once intimidating in its unfamiliar customs and elaborate expectations, had gradually become something closer to home, particularly once Edmund had ensured she retained the freedom to establish her own quiet routines within its considerable grounds. Fenwick, too, had adjusted remarkably well to his new circumstances, claiming a favored spot beside the hearth in Elena's private chambers, with the same contented ease he had once shown in her small village cottage. His age had begun to show more visibly as the months passed, his movements growing slower, his rest periods longer, but his spirit remained undiminished, and each morning he still insisted, with gentle but persistent nudging, upon his familiar walk through whatever grounds were available to them, now the palace's eastern gardens rather than the forest paths of his younger years. Edmund made time for these morning walks whenever his duties permitted, finding in their quiet familiarity the same peace he had first discovered in that distant forest clearing, though now accompanied by the additional comfort of knowing Elena walked beside him, not as a stranger he was slowly coming to know, but as someone whose trust and companionship had been tested through genuine adversity and had emerged, remarkably, stronger for having survived it. The kingdom, too, had found renewed stability in the months following Thorne's exile and Garrick's subsequent imprisonment, the council's reforms proving effective in preventing any similar concentration of dangerous ambition among the remaining noble houses. Bramwell continued his careful, watchful service, though even his usually guarded demeanor had softened considerably upon witnessing how genuinely Elena's presence had transformed Edmund's bearing, restoring a warmth and confidence to his rule that had been notably absent during the difficult years following his father's death and Grendel's subsequent passing. It was on a particularly cold morning in late winter that Fenwick's age finally caught up with him entirely, the old wolf settling into his favored spot beside the hearth and simply choosing, with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his long life, not to rise again when Elena called him for their usual walk. She knew immediately, from the peaceful stillness of his posture, that something had fundamentally shifted, and she knelt beside him with tears already gathering, running gentle hands along his graying fur, as she had done countless times before, though this time his breathing had grown noticeably shallow and slow. Edmund arrived quickly upon hearing the news, kneeling beside Elena without hesitation, his own eyes glistening with genuine grief as he offered what comfort he could, both to Elena and to the old wolf, whose loyalty and courage had proven so instrumental in preserving both their lives during the dangerous months now safely behind them. He waited, Elena said softly, her voice thick with tears, though carrying a strange, quiet peace alongside her evident sorrow. He waited until we were both here, together, safe and settled, before finally allowing himself to rest. He has earned that rest many times over, Edmund said gently, his hand resting alongside Elena's against the old wolf's fur. Few creatures, and fewer men, could claim to have shown such consistent loyalty and courage throughout their lives. They remained beside him through those final quiet moments, speaking softly of the years they each remembered, Elena recalling the frightened, half-starved pup she had first discovered near the old quarry, and Edmund recalling the fierce, unexpected courage that had saved his life not once, but twice, during the dangerous confrontations that had ultimately brought Elena so fully into his own world. Fenwick's breathing finally slowed to stillness sometime near midday, his passing as peaceful and dignified as his long life had been, surrounded by the two people who had come to love him most, in a warm room far removed from the quarry, where his own story had first begun, years before either of them could have imagined the remarkable journey that would eventually connect their separate lives so completely. They buried him beneath a young oak tree in the eastern gardens, the same gardens where his final months of walks had taken place, marking the spot with a simple stone bearing only his name, without elaborate inscription or ceremony beyond the genuine grief and gratitude both Elena and Edmund carried for the old wolf who had, in his own quiet way, first brought them together, and then helped ensure they both survived long enough to fully appreciate what that connection had ultimately grown to mean. Spring arrived gradually in the months that followed, softening the grief of that difficult winter loss, with the gentle renewal that always accompanies the changing seasons. Elena found herself returning often to the small grave beneath the young oak, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by Edmund, each visit carrying less sorrow and more genuine gratitude, as time gradually transformed her grief into warm remembrance. It was during one such visit, as the oak's new spring leaves cast dappled shadows across the small stone marker, that Edmund finally asked the question he had been quietly considering for some weeks, kneeling beside Elena near the grave that had become, in its own unexpected way, a sacred place for them both. "I have thought often, these past months, about how our story truly began," he said quietly, "not with my own curiosity that first morning, nor even with your own decision to walk that particular path. It began, I think, years before either of us met, with your choice to save a creature others believed unworthy of saving, a choice that revealed exactly the kind of person you were, long before I ever had the chance to discover it for myself." Elena looked at him curiously, sensing the significance building within his careful words. "Whatever comes next in our own story," Edmund continued, "I find I wanted to honor that same quality, the patient devotion and quiet courage that first drew my attention in that forest clearing. Elena, would you consider becoming my queen, sharing not only my life but the responsibilities and challenges that inevitably accompany it, as fully and completely as you once shared your mornings with a blind old wolf who asked for nothing beyond your steady presence?" Elena felt tears gathering again, though these carried none of winter's sorrow, only the warm fullness of genuine joy and gratitude for everything the past year had brought into her life, beginning with an arrow that had nearly struck her, and ending, remarkably, with this quiet proposal offered beside the grave of the creature who had first, unknowingly, guided them both toward this moment. "Yes," she said simply, the single word carrying more genuine certainty than any elaborate declaration might have managed. "I would consider it the greatest honor of my own life, Edmund, to walk beside you through whatever challenges and joys the years ahead may bring." They were married that summer, in a ceremony held within the palace gardens near the young oak that had become such meaningful ground for them both, the celebration drawing genuine warmth and goodwill from a kingdom that had come to know, through the widely shared story of their unusual beginning, the remarkable courage and loyalty that had first brought their king and his eventual queen together. Years later, when their own children grew old enough to ask about the small stone marker beneath the garden's oldest oak, Elena would tell them the story exactly as it had happened, of a blind old wolf who needed guiding each morning, and a king who had begun, quietly and unexpectedly, to follow. She would tell them how courage sometimes arrives not through grand, dramatic gestures, but through the simple, steady choice to care for another creature despite what others believe impossible or unworthy of such devotion. And she would remind them, each time the story reached its ending, that even the smallest acts of kindness, offered without expectation of reward or recognition, can sometimes grow into something far greater than anyone involved could have possibly imagined, reshaping not only individual lives but the very course of a kingdom's future, all beginning with nothing more than a young woman's patient devotion to a wolf that could no longer see the world, but had somehow, through instinct alone, recognized exactly the right path to lead them both toward home.